their liability is zero for only 20% fee. They get 20% of 200, it's right at $200,000. They're going to, I looked at it, they're going to like $38,000, and he wasn't on the phone with me 20 minutes and had me qualified. Think about it, $38,000 for 20 minutes? In this video, I would like to give a quick update on ERC and the issues for August 2023. I've been doing YouTubes for about 3.5 years, and there's a lot of them out there. But I think with what I see getting ready to happen in compliance, I think it's important to start to date these to where I can say, here's what's happening. So let's just jump right into it. This is more like, I've never done this before. This is more like the August news brief. And what I want to go over is that here's what IRS is now starting to say. They've been kind of quiet, as we know, but they're getting ready to, I think, make some moves. So one of the things that happened in the last month, the IRS Office of Fraud Enforcement and National Fraud Council hosted a webinar about the fraud. Also, that webinar announced that the ERC is now the top. It's the #1 non-compliance issue in IRS's Dirty Dozen. Dirty Dozen means if you're a taxpayer, don't go there. The recent publications in the last month or so, and each one of these I could do a small YouTube on, but I want to give you a quick recap, a news brief. Final regulations. IRS came out with final regulation on erroneous refunds dealing with ERC. And just the concept says that if you filed for the ERC and it's later determined you didn't qualify, this is going to be an erroneous or an excess refund. They don't have to go through an audit to prove it. They can just send out an assessment of the tax. So, I think through all this last 3 years, especially the last couple of years, there's been this thing going on, well, they're going to have to audit. No, they won't have to. But the important thing here is that I see the IRS setting up a way of being able to go a much shorter way to get to the ones that should not have got the ERC. And remember, the important thing here is for those that qualify for the ERC, it's important they get it as fast as possible. The next publication that I saw come out in the last month is Chief Counsel Memo, and there's the AM 2023-05. But Chief Counsel Memo, and I did a YouTube on it, is that they came out with the supply chain, and they gave 5 examples. And I was watching a video the other night, a couple of nights ago, and the person, I believe, I check their videos once in a while, but he made a remark that if you qualify for the ERC under the supply chain exception, is that it's not impossible to qualify, but most likely improbable. So when I look at that, my thought is, that's somebody else. That's not Larry. And these things here is IRS now. I've been doing this kind of based on what I believed. It's now coming to fruition. All the videos that I've done, you can watch them. They're on point, no matter how old they are. So the point here is supply chain is a very small, limited exception, and we'll cover it a little more in a minute. But if you're relying on that, I recommend you do some more homework. Frequently asked questions about the ERC. We got an update on the frequently asked questions, and I'll touch base on that. But the biggest one there, again, is that supply chain. So let's go on. With the supply chain on this next slide, is that the supply chain is a very limited exception. Very limited. What it says is that the ERC is not available for employers who face supply chain disruption except for this small exception. So I've put the exception right here. Employer suppliers had to be subject to a government-imposed shutdown order due to COVID-19 to qualify. The supplier steps in the shoe. So let's just for a moment step back and see what this means. In the original frequently asked questions of a couple of years ago, there was question and answer 12. And it's the only thing. Remember, supply chain is not in the CARES Act. It was not even addressed. But there was question and answer 12 in the frequently asked questions of the old day, because I just told you we got new ones out. And in that, it was very specific that it had to be related to a government imposed. And what you're going to find is you have to, so if you're going to say a supply chain, because I wasn't in the mandate, but I couldn't get my supplies, just not being able to get your supplies had nothing to do with it. You have to step in the shoes of the supplier. And in the frequently asked, in the chief counsel's opinion, the 5 examples, they reiterate that whoever your supplier you couldn't get the product from, they had to be shut down. And so you need their documentation if you get audited to prove that it was a supply chain. And that, and the other thing in that memo said, you have to look at each supplier. So you can't say, well, I couldn't get, paper towels from Charmin. It's, you couldn't get paper towels. Well, that is a business problem. We always have times in business things run short. But you have to go and say, oh, were you in a mandated government shutdown for all your facilities? And then the next thing it said, and this was also in my YouTubes 2 years ago on supply chain, was there alternative supplies? And in that memo, Chief Counsel's memo, they have an example where somebody paid 35% more for substitute product. And they said that's a business decision because everything during the pandemic became more expensive. So saying I had to pay more, I had to use a substitute item is not. The other thing I'll have to say, supply chain does not cover it when it's manufactured outside the United States. See, the supply chain, you have to prove, as it says here, and this is so important, and I'm pointing here, step in the shoes. So what that means, you have to make sure your supplier meets all the requirements for a government-mandated shutdown as you do. And then whenever you do that, you got to prove it's more than nominal to your business, which is greater than 10%. Just real quick to recap this, because there is so many people qualifying on this, and I'm going to just take the quote. There is a limited exception in cases where employer suppliers, quote, are unable to make deliveries of critical goods or materials due to a government order that has caused the supplier to suspend its operations. Okay, that's a quote out of the new guidance. That's not Larry. Read it again. Quote, are unable to make deliveries of critical goods or materials due to a governmental order that caused the supplier to suspend its operations. That's one. Where's my pen? And I put a big and here, which means you have to qualify for both. And the employer's businesses, quote, operations are fully or partially suspended as a result of the inability to obtain the critical goods or materials from its supplier because they were required to suspend their operations. So, and I'm going to do YouTube later today where that I actually went online, used one of my companies, and I qualified on the first question, supply chain, when I knew, and in that video, I'm going to show you how they're not asking the questions right. What they are missing, and then we'll move back here a slide. What they are missing is this, governmental order. You cannot check that I qualify for ERC because of a supply chain issue. You have to first prove that the supplier was under a governmental order. That's by supplier. So that means you got to get when their mandated happened. Remember in our door 1, door 2, is that if you get a door 2, whether it's you, the employer, or because of the supply chain, you can only open the door and have qualified wages from the time the mandated started till it ended. So when you're filling out your application, if you've already filled it out, you got the refund, or you haven't filled it out, or you're waiting on it to be processed, if you don't have the documentation showing that the supplier, and that look at each supplier, was in a government mandated shutdown on the exact same period you're taking wages, then you don't qualify. Next, let's move on to IRS investigation of fraud. Here's the interesting note, is that there's no statute of limitations on civil tax fraud. So And there's a 5-year statute of limitations applies to any ERC mistakenly taken during the third and fourth quarter of 2021. So when you file for that credit, you've got 5 years. But remember, if it's civil tax fraud, then you may have an issue. Here's what I see the IRS doing. I see the IRS rolling out a program here in the near future, and they're going to have, I call it a get right. And they're going to say, hey, do you want to reconsider? They're going to start with people. I testified about 3 weeks ago in the Ways and Means Committee oversight in Congress, and there was a debate whether it's 500,000 or 600,000 of these that's not been processed. I look at those. They say, hey, we've put out frequently asked questions. We put out a chief counsel memo. Here's the other. We're doing these other things that we just covered, and I believe they'll continue to do more. They're going to say, get right. And in that period of getting right, they're probably going to waive, and where I'm going to go is in the area of the final regulations. The very first item I mentioned earlier is that there's like a 21-day period. If you discover you're incorrect, you're going to be able to set up and repay it or whatever from the time of discovery for 21 days without penalties or interest. Now, that's not authority. That's Larry's knowing the tax law. So if you get that notice or you get a correspondence that says, hey, do you want to rethink this? I think you better really stop and rethink it. Go get a tax expert. And I can tell you, in the video that I'm doing on qualifying, I really am doing a video and going through step by step, partly the interview and doing the filling out the forms online. And when I go through that, you're going to see how obvious it is that these ERC scams, they're not experts. Many of them, I don't want to say all, but most of them, they're not experts. The person that called me, I went online, filled out the application, the person helped me. The person then called me back and said I qualify. It was the same sales rep. I don't know how a sales rep is this expert that they talked about. We have accountants and we have our own CPAs in the back office. We have our own attorneys. I didn't talk to one of them. The specialist I talked to, I filled out some forms. I actually qualified on the first question. But we'll see that. We'll see that over in a video. And maybe I can ask John, my production person, that when we do that video, if you could link it, put a link up here. But we'll do that video probably pretty close to sometime later today. Continuing with the IRS investigation of fraud, the final regulations increase the IRS's power to investigate and get back refunds that were taken erroneously. This is part of what I was just talking on the last slide. Everything in these slides is all new stuff in the last 30 days. So when I start seeing these news releases, I start paying attention in what they said. So final regulations increase the IRS's power to investigate and get back refunds that were erroneously taken. Well, in my video on how easy it would be to find you by the IRS would be the following. I did a video a couple weeks ago where I used Larry Gray's seminars and how I didn't qualify. In that, all they had to do was take my zip code, where the state of Missouri, there was no mandate after May 6th of 2020, and take my North America industrial code and look at it. It'd say consulting. Between the two, they could probably, if I had an application, send me a letter and say, hey, Larry, how did you qualify? I didn't, because I wasn't part of a mandate, and I didn't qualify on gross receipts. At that point in time, it's erroneous. And my concern about erroneous makes me concerned about penalties and interest. The final point in this slide is the IRS has and is developing data-driven methods for flagging suspicious returns. Again, this is news that they're announcing. Businesses that inappropriately claim the ERC may not avoid penalties for underpayment of taxes or fraud by pointing out the person who advised them to take the credit as an ERC scammer, CPA, or attorney. See, you signed the 941X as a small employer. Your name is on the line. This is payroll taxes. Stop it, payroll taxes. People say, well, I'm an innocent small business. They told me so. Well, if it's one thing to be a taxpayer, it's another thing to be a business, and it's another thing to have payroll. Payroll has trust funds in it. So in this, you're getting reimbursed. This is not free money. You're being reimbursed for payroll, including some payroll taxes. So this really concerns me because remember, if it's civil tax fraud, there's no statute of limitation. It goes on. And you cannot use the excuse. That guy that helped me last night, he's wanting to send me back my 941s. If I sign him, they'll send them in. Their liability is zero for only 20% fee. They get 20% of 200. It's right at $200,000. I looked at it, they're going to like $38,000. And he wasn't on the phone with me 20 minutes and had me qualified. Think about it. $38,000 for 20 minutes? Where's the specialist? Same person from start to finish. He helped me fill out any questions I had. Because if you have no liability and a company can make $38,000 in less than 30 minutes, too good to be true. The only reason why I say that is, as I've told you many times, I've been going through these. There's probably a dozen of these that I have actually gone online, went through the process, got up to the point of signing the contract. But remember, in the contract, they tell you, one of them says, I'm assisting you. So bottom line to all these, and I need to cut this short, it's a news brief, is that I'm going to go back to this slide as a summary. Final regulations is on erroneous refunds, which means could be civil, tax fraud, or erroneous refund. 2, Chief Counsel memo, the takeaway there is that it's not impossible to use the supply chain, but it's very improbable you'll qualify for it. And the other thing, remember, if you're going to say supply chain, you've got to have what caused each supplier that was more than nominal to you, which were more than 10% of your revenues or 10% of your time, impacted you, that you were partially shut down, and that they were suspended. And finally, frequently asked questions. That one we saw in this deck, they absolutely had to be shut down. Thank you for listening to this video. I'm getting ready to do one on my roadmap. I'm going to start a series on that. And the other thing, I will continue to keep you updated. Look forward to seeing you on the next video. Stay tuned. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but sometimes in business and in a pandemic, there is bad news. Thank you.